Everyone, welcome. It's great to see you all here. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's L. Jackson Newell Liberal Arts and Science Lecture, which is going to be given by Professor Wendy Wischer from the College of Fine Arts. I'm Monisha Pashupathy. I serve the Honors College as an Associate Dean, and today I'm going to try to stand in for Dean Torty, who regrets that she is not able to be here tonight. This lecture is really special to me because it represents the coming together of so much of what I love about the people in the Honors College, about our mission and our values, and it's also a chance to recognize and honor the namesake of the lecturer, Jack Newell. In the Honors College, we're committed to the enduring value of the liberal arts tradition in education. And what that means for us is the cultivation of open minds, the capacity to engage across disciplinary lines, and the pursuit of a good life, variously understood and variously pursued, the role of the university in building and making things that expand our horizons, and the ability to engage with one another across difference. So 4 years ago, the Honors Core faculty wanted to create a lecture series in order to kind of showcase this enduring relevance of liberal arts and sciences. And they wanted to do that by honoring faculty all across our campus for their contributions to that tradition, and to make a way in which those faculty could showcase their contributions for a public audience. And so as they built this idea for the lecture, we sought to find a proper name. And they voted to name the series for L. Jackson Newell, Jack Newell, because of his longstanding, lifelong commitment to that liberal arts tradition in higher education. And Jack told me I was allowed to say he only allowed the lecture series to be named for him if it also retained the liberal arts and science moniker, because that is the lifelong commitment that he has had. I do, though, want to say a couple words about Jack Newell so you just understand why he's such an ideal namesake for this lecture, and I hope he'll forgive me. He's a historian and philosopher of higher education who joined the University of Utah as a professor of higher education in 1974. He also served for 16 years at what, believe it or not, was then called the Dean of Liberal Education. This is now what we call undergraduate studies. And in that role, one of the things Jack did is he relentlessly pursued passionate liberal arts and sciences faculty and persuaded them to teach undergraduate courses and engage with undergraduates, bringing students with them to intellectual and creative frontiers. Jack's also always been involved in really kind of cutting edge parts of the educational landscape. In 1995, he took a leave from the university and he served as president of Deep Springs College, until 2004. I highly recommend a little Googling of Deep Springs College. It's a really fascinating place, especially if you're interested in different ways of doing education. He returned afterwards, and as professor emeritus, he resumed teaching, and we had the great fortune to have Jack Newell teach for us in the Honors College over the past several years. But he also carried that liberal arts ideal and that liberal arts tradition into the broader Utah community via what's called the Clemente program, a program for low-income adults, and a program that continues to exist as a partnership between the Utah Humanities, Honors College, Westminster College, and Salt Lake Community College. There are high school versions of Clemente at East and West High School, and it's a pipeline for first-generation students to come to the university. Jack Newell, in keeping with the liberal arts and sciences tradition, is also a scholar. I want to mention two books that may be of particular interest to this crowd. One is called The Electric Edge of Academe, and this is the history of Deep Springs College, published in 2015. And most recently, a book called Conscience and Community, co-written with Bob Goldberg and Linda Newell. And this chronicles the lives and contributions of Sterling McMurrin, Obert Tanner, and Lowell Benyon. These are three outstanding and influential scholars and leaders whose names you will see all over this campus. So Jack teaches in the tradition of the liberal arts and sciences, engaging students as co-learners, giving them the opportunity, or maybe experienced differently, the demand to think independently, to think creatively, and to thrive in ambiguity. He pushes students to find a line between being true to themselves, but also open to, respectful of, and even celebrating differences. This fellowship, I think, is really well named for someone who has had that lifelong commitment to the liberal arts and sciences. And so we're really proud and honored to be able to kind of continue that ethos and to host this lecture series each year and kind of continue celebrating that liberal arts tradition. So that said, I'm going to hand things over to honors faculty member Brian Kabarich, who chaired the committee that selected this year's fellow, and he's going to give you a few words about Dr. Wendy Wischer and the ways in which she came to the top of our list.
Thank you. Hello. Art Jackson Newell speaker for 2022 is Wendy Wischer. Wendy is Associate Professor of Sculpture and Intermedia in the College of Fine Arts here at the University of Utah, where she has taught since 2012. In 2014, she received an honors professorship, which allowed her to create the innovative course Art, Action, and Environment, Fostering Awareness and Understanding of the college's green infrastructure and pollinator garden. In another iteration of Wendy's course, she drew attention to Red Butte Creek, which runs, unbeknownst to most persons, invisibly beneath our campus. In other semesters, Wendy has drawn attention to local environments such as that of the Jordan River. In addition to teaching, Wendy is a practicing artist who divides her time between Utah and Florida, where she earned her MFA in studio art from Florida State University. In introducing Wendy, I want to focus on two aspects of her work. One is her wish to convert data into personal meaning, and the other is her staging of encounters between nature and new media. Teachers in the humanities are paid to foster critical thinking in their students. Now, I've come to dislike that automated phrase, critical thinking, but I certainly do enjoy the activity that it names. My worry is that often people think of critical thinking as mere fault finding, and this misperception is understandable as fault finding has become a bit of a national pastime. Students are not immune to this, as pointing out supposed contradictions in an author seems like a good way to score points in class, and I get it because I was a student too. But teachers need to show students that critical thinking can also be a creative act, one in which we discover and demonstrate in a climate of confusion and anxiety that something is pleasing and just, even if it is not perfect. Wendy excels at this kind of instruction. The heuristic event, which we announce when we say eureka, is of crucial importance in a world obsessed with pointing the finger, in which we have internalized what my students have learned to call the great grammarian in the sky, an agency constantly hovering over our every potential gaffe with its metaphysical red pen in hand. It's perhaps worth considering that while earlier eras have had their terms for praise and blame, our own society might lack a word for the opposite of fault-finding. Yes, we have applause, we have emojis, we have likes, but those are vague, while fault-finding is highly specific. In search of the missing term, I lowered myself and committed of typical first-year sin. I looked in Webster's dictionary, trying to find an antonym for fault-finding, and wouldn't you know it, I found this: uncritical. Our culture seems to have, okay, I'll say it this way. As a culture, positive criticism seems to stump us. Such absences of keywords are significant. Elaine Scarry remarks about our consumer culture, there is no brand of aspirin called Willow, no package entwined with willow wands, no magazine or television ad that carries us under the branches of this tree, reminding us why it is the symbol of empathy. Such lacunas in language are symptomatic of the fact that we live in a state of both excess and deficiency. We have swimming pools while others scarcely find water to drink. We share an abundance of memes every day, yet when entreated to speak, we still have nothing to say. Words once pronounced with confidence now sound empty or even offensive. The critic Walter Benjamin, ironically now almost a household name, says that our persistent and thoughtless application of once cherished concepts, creativity, genius, timeless, classic, mystical, magical, their overuse transforms lived experience into a mere processing of data, one he considers authoritarian. A far less monetizable critic, Clement Greenberg, writing at the same time as Benjamin, says that our society in its current state of development has become incapable of justifying its cultural forms as normal and inevitable. We can no longer assume anything. All the verities associated with religion, authority, tradition, style have been thrown into question, and writers, artists, and even humanities teachers can no longer predict the response of their audience, of their students, to once familiar cultural references. In the absence of authoritative standards, to what can we turn for a reality check? How do we know that we're doing okay? Some would advise us to consult the market, but the market is precisely what convinced us that even our most cherished values are negotiable. Well, what about analytics? Analytics, as Benjamin argues, is precisely what gave us the market. Here, Wendy Wischer can help us. I return to Wendy's stated aims: converting data into personal meaning and creating an encounter between nature and new media. I haven't read Wendy's talk for tonight, but I suspect she will suggest to us that analytics, which turn nature and experience into a function, are not always the answer. Perhaps the truth is not always objective and statistical, some composite of numbers or examinations, but rather the truth might be subjective and universal. Perhaps truth is not data, but a feeling, one we call beauty. Hardly anyone agrees on which things we should designate as beautiful or as art, but we recognize a certain feeling when singular persons, singular things, and singular environments, whether wild or cultivated, draw us into a chiasm, a co-discovery or collaborative encounter, each participant illuminating the other. Suddenly we recall how it feels not merely to be productive, but to be alive. We point to such singularities and call them beautiful, fitting, and just. Beauty is something we construct, but is also something that we can find. For the artist Marcel Duchamp, the judgment of taste, which is the opposite of fault-finding, emerges as a primary mode of artistic practice. We can make art simply by gesturing toward it, by shining a light. Emerson says that there is no object so foul that the proper light cannot make it beautiful. I think of Emerson when considering the function of light in Wendy's art. It illuminates for us the critical difference between the well-wrought and the merely manufactured. It teaches us the difference between the disclosure of the world and its mere commercial packaging. It encourages us to enjoy things without being driven to own them. Light can be felt, but never touched. It opens, often through mere pointing, a refuge for incalculable experiences. Its value is not merely aesthetic, but also ethical. Like public lands, ancient lights are not meant to be privatized. We ought not to dump on our public lands, but it is just as important not to take chunks away from them. Non-negotiable spaces demand that we resist the thrill of destroying them, and that we resist the equally real temptation to improve them, to correct everything. Instead, they invite us simply to notice, to witness, both them and who we become when we inhabit them. The art of Wendy Wischer invites us to become better residents of the earth. And away you go.
excuse me while I get situated. Can you all hear me? Is the mic on? Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that introduction. Very kind of you. If I could have the lights dimmed, because I'm going to start the presentation fairly quickly. First, I want to thank the Honors College for selecting me as the 2022 L. Jackson Newell Fellow. I am truly honored to receive this award named after the inspirational legacy of Jack Newell. I also want to thank you all for being here, and again, I'm truly honored. Can we lower the lights? You can lower them more because we'll have some dark imagery. That should be pretty good, thank you. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the land we are on. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. And while it is not enough to simply acknowledge this land through land acknowledgements, it is a critical first step in reminding us of the history of the land that we gather on today. Tonight I'm going to start with a brief trajectory of my work, share some of the collaborations with scientists and engineers, and then share some thoughts on art and science collaborations moving forward. It's a little bit of a departure from my typical art talk, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a background into how I have gotten where I am today. So my artwork has always been inspired by the natural environment, and with our increasing global climate crisis, I am compelled to focus on environmental issues, to finding pathways and creating experiences, as Brian mentioned, to translate data into personal meaning. Through my creative explorations, often in collaboration with scientists, engineers, and community collaborators, a wide range of data types are investigated to link nature with technology, science with mythology, and personal identity with universal connections, all while addressing our current climate crisis in hopes of finding impactful ways to help connect people more deeply with the environments they live in and with each other. I spent my childhood in rural Wisconsin in environments like this, landscapes like this, and certainly gazing at the stars many, many nights. In my early 20s, I moved to Miami, where we couldn't see the stars because of light pollution, and I found myself often driving by the high-rises and being filled with a strange nostalgia for the stars when I would see the lights. And about this time, I had gone to New York for the first time, and I saw a lot of artwork in a very short period of time. And there's something that happens when you see a lot of artwork all at once. You basically remember about 5 pieces, just a handful that resonate. And while I was making artwork about the environment and using natural materials such as sticks and leaves and rocks, I found myself really resonating with video and sound and technology. And I had to ask myself, why as a viewer was I so drawn to this work that I wasn't making myself? And so in search of this, I went to light. Light is its same form, whether it's artificial or natural. It comes from the stars. Our sun is a star. And so I started using theatrical lights. I started using the Source 4, which is a very typical light in theater, and a gobo pattern, which is the pattern that goes inside, and projecting different ideas about what we see in the night sky, using marbles, clear marbles that I placed on top of the light patterns that made them appear as if they were glowing from beneath. And for me, I was really interested in this idea that most of us have some form of a childhood memory of playing with marbles, and then I was dealing with universal imagery, which we can't even see, although the new Jebb telescope is making that so much easier and so beautiful. I also did a piece called Full to Wailing and Back. This is the moon projected. It's 26 feet diameter. It started on the night of the full moon, and every night I changed it to match what was in the sky. I was thinking about the phrase where they said technology takes us away from nature. And I thought, well, perhaps in the right context, it could guide us back to it. And so that's what happened. People would drive by and they would see the projection and they would look up and it was imitating the moon. There's a lot of people who thought I was somehow capturing the moon through a camera, but it was far more Disney. Remember, I was in Florida. I just simply bought a stock image, modified it, and could hand the moon to people. But it turned out to be so amazing. I still have people who say, I saw the moon last week and I thought of you and your piece. To me, the greatest compliment I could ever receive in my career. I continued to work with light for a while. I worked with the light and marble pieces in the theatrical lighting. These were based on the geometry of John Martineau, who I had contacted and gave me permission to use his geometry. He had discovered that every pair of planets revolve around each other as they revolve around the sun, making these beautiful patterns that often look like jewelry or lace. Here you can see I'm using a 50-degree angle lens, and so the little boy is discovering that the light is coming from above. And by bending the light, I created the rainbow spectrum with the clear marbles. I've also made many trees. I continue to make trees. I have made over 50 trees in my career. I am a woodland creature at heart, and I absolutely love them. But I was still thinking of light. And so the leaves are made with mirrored mylar, and the light is reflecting off of them just like a disco ball would. But because the leaves are organic, so are the reflections around the room. I have used tiles, little mirrored tiles like disco ball lights. This is a baobab tree about 8 feet tall. And one of my interests was that to use a single object and fill an entire room, but just with the use of light. At the same time, the mirror allows the viewer to see themselves physically in the piece, the color of their clothing, their hair, their skin. There's a great quote by Arthur Danto who says, "We go back to look at a work of art again and again, not in hopes of seeing something new in the piece, but in hopes of seeing something new in ourselves." And so I love this idea of kind of both physically and metaphorically reflecting the viewer. At the same time, light occupies space. It is moving, it is performative, it is waves. And so by filling the room as people moved around, their shadows would intercept these light reflections, making the walls and the ceiling shimmer, but making evidence the existence of light and space. I continued to work with that. This is a piece called Shattered, and it was capturing the moment of a tree that has fallen, the fragility of nature. And at the same time, I was thinking about that phrase, if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? And there's beauty in sometimes decay. I've made a lot of wire trees, often suspended. I've made forests of trees with roots that are no longer connected to the ground, that have become like aquatic beings. And this led me, shortly after I moved here, to work on a series called Your Memory is Already Fading. And this is a garden that is made out of clear resin, where I made every petal, every leaf, every stem separate and connected them. This is a garden of plants and a tree that are on endangered lists around the world. The glass-like material references the fragility of these pieces, while at the same time giving them a ghost-like quality. 1 in 5 plant species in the world is approaching extinction, yet they're often overlooked in biodiversity debates. For this particular project, I had contacted Christopher Kaiser Bunbury, a conservation and community ecologist who focuses on plant-animal interactions and invasion processes in disturbed environments. He was kind enough to provide me with full photographs of the Eliocarpus plant, or the Bois de Nantel tree. This was the most endangered tree on our planet, and at that time there were only 2, mainly because they don't have any commercial value. Another resource was the University of Utah's Rare and Endangered Plant Research Center, where I received information from Rita Reiser that focused on endangered plants in Utah. And this installation is accompanied by a whispered script on loss that I'd like to play for you now. Does anyone know how to get rid of that subtitle? It's not supposed to be there.
The wind came today and took you away from me. gone. You disappeared, taking part of me with you. I felt it leave with a sharp tear in my heart. The loss was immediate and profound. How I wish I could see you once more. Hear your voice. Tell you I'm sorry for all the times I hurt you. I'm sorry. The rushing emotion crashes over me like a giant wave full of fury, drowning me so I'm gasping for air just to stay alive. The pain sears through me mercilessly. Your memory is already fading. I fear more loss when I won't remember the sound of your voice. When the wind returns from circling the earth and you are not with it. When seasons have come and gone and I am seeing my own death lurking in the shadows. My own capture and release from the wind.
So, thank you. I started writing original scripts, really kind of am talking about my own personal journey and combining them with environmental issues. I know myself best, so that was my way to start to get this personal connection. And actually that script was written after my mother died, but it felt like a good kind of combination. And so I continued with that. This piece is called Escaping Gravity. This represents fragments of my journey to free myself from gravitational pulls, both physical and emotional. It explores my shifting relationship with nature and my shifting relationship with myself. The projected video onto sculptural rock piles or cairns references the life cycle of birth, growth, decay, death, and rebirth, as well as the major signals or trail markers of our current environmental issues, such as air and water quality, soil and forest conditions, energy use, and waste. Sometimes I read the scripts myself, and sometimes I hire actresses to read them for me. The full video of this is 11 minutes, but I'm just going to play a short clip for you.
Gravity is the weakest of the four fundamental interactions with nature. It has very little influence on the smallest of particles and plays no role in determining the internal properties of everyday matter. As usual, I was thinking about the moments of the past, letting my memory rush over them like water rushing over the stones on the bottom of a stream. While we are bound by gravitational pull, we also possess the ability to free ourselves from its grasp. Or do we? I too can write the saddest poem of all tonight. Am I seeing the signs correctly? Do I understand which way to go? Like a gravestone, they mark the spot. Is this where the path ends, or is it where it begins? There are cemeteries that are lonely.
And I'll stop there with that one. You guys are very kind. It was around this time that I discovered and joined the Global Change and Sustainability Center here at the University of Utah, and it changed my life in many ways. Through the GCSC, I was able to connect with researchers from a wide range of disciplines who were interested in interdisciplinary and collaborative research. This led to collaborations on specific projects, grants, participating on committees around the nature of interdisciplinary work, as well as on the environmental issues that I am so passionate about. One early collaboration was with computer engineer Eric Brunvand called Collective Currents. Eric and I have been interested in arts-tech collaboration for a while, and we had been talking about working together. And it was the anniversary of 9 Evenings that was the catalyst for this project. 9 Evenings was a series of events in New York in 1966 between artists and engineers working with Bell Laboratories. For this piece, we wanted to collaborate with each other and also to encourage collaboration amongst others. At the same time, we were engaged in an ongoing conversation about water in the West. We also thought the idea of collaboration in the abstract is interesting, but when the thing you are talking about is collaboration itself, the conceptual complexity is what allows the piece to become more expansive. The physical cooperation in our installation is through a circuit, requiring that the viewers form a human chain between interaction points, which consist of bronze casts of our hands. In that mode, the viewers are encouraged to create a larger chain by holding hands and cooperating. We have discussed how this was pre-pandemic, and now we're not encouraged to hold hands. So we're trying to figure out where this piece fits. But as the viewers engage in this, the audio of water sounds move from garbled water sounds to recognizable babbling water sounds, and the projected video fragments change from dark, contaminated water to clean flowing water, and at the same time, they begin to connect together to create a comprehensible video picture. The larger the human chain, the more cohesive the sounds and images are in relation to each other. While the picture becomes clear, there is still overlap of some of the image fragments and imperfect unity. This comments on the difficulty and imperfection of ecological restoration as a practice. In addition, we wrote a paper about our project that was published in the Leonardo MIT Press Direct, titled Collective Currents, Exploring Sustainability Through Collaborative and Interactive Installations. I was then invited to attend the Crossroads of Art and Science annual residency at the Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, Florida. For the past several years, artists have been invited to FGCU to explore connections between the arts and sciences while working with FGCU faculty and students. During my residency, I worked with Wynne Everham, professor of environmental studies, and his students from Conservation Strategies for a Sustainable Future. The results of these collaborations were both tangible and immediate, as well as intangible and enduring. A student-focused exhibit entitled Stop and Listen, Environmental Awareness and Restoration came out of these conversations and featured creative writing, theater, science, art, and graphic design students. Another student collaborative project titled Sacred Spaces was part of the residency. I collaborated with students to identify 4 sacred spaces for the placement of the 4 sculptures titled Templa. The locations for the permanent site-specific sculptures were chosen to encourage the discovery of these less traveled spaces across the FGCU campus. Templa consists of 4 cast concrete stumps covered with mirrored tiles that mark each of the 4 different spaces. The colors of the nearby surroundings, as well as the viewers who stop and sit, can be seen in the reflection, creating an ever-changing and fluid image. The pieces mark a special place for contemplation, where one can sit and ponder the environment, both within themselves and that which surrounds them. The students had also written 4 poems to go along with the 4 sacred spaces. And for my main project as part of this residency, I created a multimedia installation titled Parallel Journeys. Parallel Journeys is a 6-channel video and sound installation of a psychological exploration of the conscious and unconscious mind, above and below the surface. At the same time, it dives in and out of emotional experience such as joy, sorrow, loss, fear, hope, and peace. Similar to the small percentage of our conscious minds, only 5% of the oceans have been explored, and the rest remains unknown. I am beginning to grasp that we will have to explore within, deep in our subconscious, to understand our human nature in order to be able to solve the challenges we face, understanding what drives us deep inside, what compels us to compete with greed, act in ways that ultimately hurt ourselves, and live by the systems that destroy the same environments that sustain us. I believe this will be an important step in correcting those flaws. I then worked with geophysicist Jeffrey Moore, who I believe was your lecturer last year, on a project called Displacing Vibrations, a multimedia exhibit that includes 2D and 3D works inspired by an interest in creating a unique experience that shifts the perception of the culturally rich and iconic red rock arches in ways that unveil connections with our surroundings, specifically the unique landscape of southern Utah and the controversial issues around ownership, stewardship, and national treasure. I accompanied Jeff and his team to some of the arches where he was recording vibrational data with seismic sensors to help determine structural integrity. In December of 2017, the boundaries of Bears Ears that you see on the right were cut by 85%, and in the same stroke, Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, in place since 1996, was reduced by 47% on the left. With the reductions, 115 natural red rock arches were stripped of federal protection. Now, these boundaries have been restored. When the Biden administration took office, they restored them from their original boundaries, but they're still very controversial. Our current state legislators are suing the Biden administration for doing this. I created the boundaries out of mirror, creating a non-traditional drawing so that the viewers saw themselves and didn't see themselves in the different sets of boundaries, placing them as stakeholders and as part of the carbon footprint. Across from the drawings was another drawing and chalk drawing of an arch where I had erasers but no chalk, because once these are gone, they take millennia to form. They won't come back and may not show up again for several generations, if at all. I had also created an animation with the subtlety, movement, and sounds of the vibrational recordings to make animate and bring the dynamic nature of this seemingly static and lifeless rock to part of the experience. And I had created an installation using sped up recorded vibration data, making it audible. These sound vibrations became sound sculptures and played through high-tech sound systems. So you could feel them through the sculptures, through the floors, through the walls, as well as hear them. We were interested in showing how the arches are dynamic, lively features, constantly in motion, constantly evolving in response to the forces from their surroundings. In 2019, I was part of a large collaboration of a group that received a 1U, 4U grant here at the university with PIs Hassa Borup and Elizabeth Corbelo Gonzalez from the School of Music. Artivism for Earth, based in climate change, is an expression of sounds, words, visuals, and science. Due to the pandemic, it became an online symposium where a series of performances of music, visual art, and poetry and science present the urgency of climate justice in a new and innovative light to give clarity of action to the defining issue of our generation. Some of the materials from Artivism for Earth were presented at an event at the COP26 in Glasgow last spring. It was selected as a recipient for the 2002 inaugural Anthem Awards. My contribution to this collaboration consisted of 2 pieces. A video of dark clouds, as you see here, projected onto Hassa Borup, playing an original score by John Luther Adams, and a video piece in 9 parts that served as the transitions between the different performances and videos of the online event. For the transitions, I worked with poet Catherine Coles, who also teaches in humanities, and I'd like to play you a combined clip from that.
Only the wind. First, the one I was born into, which I must invent, its brimming light and thunder. Then the one I escaped, the other 4. Fast skies and streets, sluicing rainwater, and the next, which filled with glass. The truth is, I can't remember, not those I lived in, or those I visited, pacing fast along their rivers. Not really. There, fly the leaves. From what tree? Maple, olive. Winter lasts longer now, and so does summer. They come. Again, the leaves. So soon my head bursts open with them. The wind also returns, the famous relentless one that circulates. All the way round, up high, you can feel how it cleanses and carries away and brings everything back, even the trees. I won't say it flies, a tree that big. But I have seen trees fly. If I hadn't, wouldn't I remember?
At the same time, I was working on a multiple-year collaboration with geologist Brenda Bowen around her research out on the Bonneville Salt Flats. After many field visits, lab visits, conversations, we presented an experimental art exhibition that included sculptures, photographs, video, sound sculptures, and drawing, interwoven with scientific data displays in an integrated format that encouraged the viewer to discover the connecting threads throughout the complexity of the changing salt flats and our intricate relationships to it. Evaporated, Explorations in Art, Science, and Salt was shown at the Granary in Ephraim. It explored the rapidly changing Bonneville Salt Flats in northwest Utah through both the lens of art and science. The exhibition provided an opportunity for both of us to experiment with the different ways of sharing our research, scholarly and creative, in hopes of inspiring understanding and the connections and the differences between visual art, geoscience, and the diversity of the landscape. Throughout our collaboration, we have valued the unique contributions at both art and science and explored the power of bringing the two perspectives together. Granary Arts Executive Director Amy Jorgensen recently explained that this exhibit is a departure for the exhibition space. By presenting both art and scientific data, visitors gain a new understanding of how place can be seen, processed, and defined. There is data to be found, and it's worth the time to study what this team presents. Exhibits such as this will become increasingly common. The Anthropocene era we created and inhabit calls for information and action through the lenses of art to mitigate the climate crisis we currently find ourselves in. So this is an example of one of the art displays that's showing microscopic imagery of microbes, and also data that showed that CO2 was being released from the salt flats every 24 hours. Again, looking at a notion of a place that seems barren and lifeless and showing that it has life. So I created a sound sculpture with a large chunk of salt that had headphones connected to it and had created a sound piece of breathing mixed with other sounds. Another display showed the decrease in the racetrack. We all know the salt flats is the place where we break speed records. And the racers will also claim that they want to save the salt. However, they continue to race when conditions are unfavorable. So in response, I made a sculpture with a tire that was put in a brine pond and grew salt crystals, because if they left it alone, the salts will grow. And then I took photos of this piece and placed mirrors below, because this salt pan fills with water and creates a beautiful mirror imagery, blowing all kind of notions of space with above and below. Throughout the collaboration, we have a collaborative paper with the same title, Evaporated Explorations in Art, Science, and Salt, has just been accepted at the Leonardo MIT and will be published in 2023. It has been an honor to be able to be a visual artist and also disseminate my work in a scholarly manner, with collaborators, of course. The last piece I want to share is called Written on the Wind. This is 360 degrees of projected video onto a 17-foot spiral room with stereo sound. This installation is part of Nature All Around Us, which was a special exhibition created to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Natural History Museum of Utah here in Salt Lake City. It focuses on nature in cities, towns, from our backyards to Main Street, as well as open spaces and parks. Written on the Wind creates a multi-sensory experience that travels through 24 hours, from sunrise to sunrise in 24 minutes. Through an immersive adventure of sound, projected video, animation, and sculptural clouds to relax into, the viewer takes a journey through the cycle of moving from light into darkness and darkness into light. This installation attempts to capture fragments of how nature makes us feel, fragments of the joy and curiosity often felt when experiencing nature and the restorative effects this can provide. A place where our stories are written on the wind that circles the planet continuously and creates connective threads that weave a journey both individual and shared. I started working on the project with inspiration of 2 workshops with 4th graders at Riley Elementary, beginning as most artists and scientists do, with observation. With the students, we collected ideas and observations about nature and turned these into words and drawings and poetry. I'd like to play a short video clip. I collaborated with local composers Michael Wall and Austin Booth for some of the sound components, and all of the video footage was captured here in Utah. The original video is 24 minutes, but I'm only going to play a 4-minute clip. Nature All Around Us, including Written on the Wind, has been modified for traveling. It's set to travel across the US through 2030, and it opens at the Science Museum of Minnesota next week. So that piece, as I said, I'm very excited that that is going to be opening at the Science Museum of Minnesota next week, and look forward to it traveling beyond. My experience working collaboratively with other disciplines has shown how creative process and creative problem solving have the ability not only to help with the broader impact and communication of ideas, but it holds the potential to impact the research by expanding areas not directly related to observable evidence. Addressing our global climate crisis and environmental issues demands new ways of thinking and perceiving to find solutions to the ever-increasing problems we face. Interdisciplinary research between the arts and science holds the potential for informing new pathways of research and dissemination that have not been realized without it. Some of the things that I have learned is communication and language becomes really important when working interdisciplinary. Some disciplines will use the same terms but assign different meaning to them. At the same time, values can be very different in different disciplines. And so we need platforms that bring people together where they can hear and share why things are valuable or not seen as valuable, what the different terms and languages are, so that we can really have effective creative problem solving. Thierry Demey, considered the father of screen dance, described collaboration beautifully when he said it's not always about two people coming together and meeting on the same playing field. It's about them being on a seesaw and a delicate balance where you allow someone to have their expertise shine through, and then you also allow the other person to come and let their expertise shine through. And of course, there are moments where they come together equally in the middle, but that's where we're going to find a true collaborative project that can move forward. Art can be subjective, and it has the potential to change consciousness through creating emotional connections. Art can ask questions without having to focus on the answer. And because of this, art can move the viewers in emotional ways. And when we are moved, we tend to act. I often say to my students, think about when and why you would give someone money. And it's because you care about them, you feel bad for them, you want to help them. It's an emotional urge that pushes you to do that. And so emotions, I believe, become really important. And this questioning can provoke the viewer to come to conclusions and interpretations based on their own understanding, which connects them more deeply with the content. It can also provoke conversations with others to arrive at conclusions and interpretations with the possibility of leading them back to the data. Art can help us cope and deal with grief and build hope. We live in a time of grief and anxiety, but also a time of opportunity. The world will be reshaped, and it will have to be a collective solution. We need to imagine beneficial relationships between humans and nature now so that we can understand what we are working towards, and we can use climate change as an opportunity to repair our relationships with nature if we seek it. Art is also incredibly good at institutional critique, and we need to critique these systems from the inside if we expect to change or shift them. We need to be able to imagine a better future. It is far easier to imagine what we don't want, and far harder to imagine what we do. And I believe that art can play a critical role in this, as we know that human stories are more powerful than data alone. And as I move forward, I plan to continue to seek out collaborative, interdisciplinary opportunities as we can achieve far more together than with one discipline alone. My next project will be unveiled in January of '23. It's called In Search of Blue Sky. It's a collaboration with atmospheric scientist John Lynn and PhD student in creative writing Lindsay Webb. This collaboration is intended to use air quality data collected as part of the Wasatch Environmental Observatory, or WEO. In particular, we will use the unique communication of visual and literary art to engage members of the public through a focus on common ground, blue skies and clean air, and connect them to the air quality information collected as part of the mobile platforms and the Utah Transit Authority tracks and electric buses. And to close, I'd like to share a quote from Lucy Lepard. Of course, art cannot change the world alone, but it is a worthy ally to those challenging power with unconventional solutions. And of course, I'm open to questions, any and all.
Mic here. And I will wave your hand and I will run to you with a mic so everybody can hear.
Do you think the fact that humans are more swayed by story than actual data is a feature or a bug of the human condition?
Well, that's a good question. And I think, in a sense, yes, it goes back to emotions. We are emotional beings, and we respond based on our emotions. It's just kind of who we are. So I think, yes. Stories often move us in ways, whether that's a story through movie, a story through sound. It could be a story told through food, right? So stories are what tend to move us. Poetry, even TV shows.
So is that a feature or a bug? Is it something that's built in that's good?
I think it's something that's good, because often our emotions are what move us to help others. We see this in a crisis, and we're going to be facing a lot more environmental disasters and crises. We're in one right now with Florida, right? Just having had a huge hurricane that went through. People rise to the occasion when there is crisis and help each other. And so I would see that as a great feature.
I noticed that a lot of the art you create is like very large scale and a lot of like sculptural pieces. Have you always been interested in those sorts of things? Did you start off with those larger, I imagine, more expensive projects, or?
You know, it's a funny question. I mean, you know, I often say go big or go home. It is a problem and it's a joy. Early in my career, I would make things and my friends would say, well, you clearly don't want to sell this because nobody could buy it. I do make some small things. I recently made a very large forest of miniature trees, but I tend to like to work big, and sometimes I'm not even intending to work big. But I'm really interested in immersive experiences, and I consider myself an installation artist, which means I create an environment that you walk into. And I'm thinking about sound, and I'm thinking about light, I'm thinking about your physical body and your presence and what you do in that. And so I'm really interested in those as a whole, but not necessarily exclusively. I have some videos that I've done just for the monitor. But I love those experiences. So I think that's part of why they get bigger. We have 4 sheds around our house. We have storage in our yard. We have things in our walls, literally.
So one of the things I noticed about this presentation is that like art can be used to inspire us so greatly and to connect it with issues facing us today. So my question is, crap, I just slipped my mind. That is the worst possible time. Here it is. How do you keep yourself engaged, obviously, in these issues emotionally, especially like, because after like viewing certain art pieces, like as days go by, like memory kind of fades and then like the motivation kind of goes away. So what keeps you engaged throughout this process for so long?
That's a great question. And I will say, you know, I spent so much time in nature in my childhood that it really formed a sense of identity. And so I often think of some of the work as a love letter to the planet. I really feel this incredible affection for the natural environment. And being part of the GCSC has put me on committees with people that are so intelligent and have so much knowledge, and I've learned so much. And I really feel that I want to use my platform to help, right? I could no longer just make work about the beauty of nature and what I felt, although I have kind of come full circle in how important that relationship is that we have with nature. But I feel it's really important for me to learn and understand some of this data. I read lots of papers. I've had researchers say, you're the only one who's read every single paper I've written on this particular subject, because the more that I know, the more informed I am, the better I'm going to be able to comment on it, the better I'm going to be able to represent it. And so I feel that's crucial. So I engage in that. I read it. I actively seek it out. Now you mentioned something else, like how do you stay emotionally evolved? Because any time that we're dealing with the climate crisis, and I say climate crisis because it's not just change, and I think one of the biggest mistakes that we make is we talk about it in the future when we should be talking about it in the past. It already happened. We're in the middle of it now. Is that, there is this idea of anxiety, and so if I can do something to help, that makes me feel better. It goes back to the emotions. When we help other people through a crisis, we end up healing ourselves. And also, I recently attended a lecture where people were talking about it, and that question was posed, and they said, because we have no choice. We have to keep going. We have to keep trying. We have to keep seeking out and finding solutions.
So most of your artwork is visual installations. I'm wondering if you could go a little bit more into what role sound and music plays into your art.
That's a great question too. I got into sound through video primarily. I was very naive. I didn't study sound, and then as I wanted to work with it, began to study it more. I feel that sound adds an emotion or a tone, and it can really kind of express this overarching mood that I'm trying to guide you into. And like a story, right? I can have an introduction, introduce characters, have some kind of situation or a climax and a resolution with sound. And so I find that sound just adds this other thing. We are so drawn to these experiences of sound, but always with my sound, I include sounds from the natural environment. Wind and wind through trees and water and crickets and birds, and I seek out very specific sounds to add to that. Again, I find I'm kind of redirecting attention to these to bring awareness. I'm using a lot of new media, but we see nature mediated through the media, and so I want to harness that and use that as a way to redirect us to the natural environment experiences at the same time. We're not going to get rid of our phones unless there's some catastrophe that knocks out the internet and all electricity. But how can we find a reconciliation, which I think is really key as we move forward? We need to find reconciliation with our human needs and then the non-human needs on this planet. That was kind of I went off topic, but.
So I'm wondering, for many of your pieces, it seems like the viewers are part of that art, and they become part of it as they interact with it. And I'm wondering if you see the audience as like a fundamental part of your art, and do you want them to know that walking into it, or is it something you want them to discover for themselves?
That's a good question. I mean, the way I teach and understand art is it's a triangle. It's me as the artist, it's the object or experience or whatever I'm creating, and it's the viewer. I'm communicating, right? We know that we have the 5 senses of knowing the world, but there's so much more to life. It's our imagination, our beliefs, that sixth sense, that feeling, that intuition. And I believe artists take that and they bring it back into the 5 senses to communicate. So I'm always interested in communicating with other people. Otherwise, I would keep it in my house and not show it with anyone. But I want that communication. But there's a moment where then I let it go and let them find their own experience with it. But I do love that even before I started making, this last piece had clouds, literally gave you a seating place that people would just lay on the floor. And I love that. I kind of thought that was a compliment to want to spend time.
So you talk a lot about collaboration in your art, and I was wondering how you kind of begin that process, because with a lot of your pieces, you're approaching such huge topics, and how do you begin to parse what is the most important and what you want to highlight in a piece, and especially when you're working with somebody else?
That's a great question. I'm fortunate when I found the GCSC that not only did I find researchers who were interested in similar topics, but they also found me. And so sometimes through word of mouth, people are contacting me, and sometimes I'm reaching out and seeking collaboration with people. And that's part of my creative processing. Artists and scientists do the same thing. We recognize patterns that most people overlook. And so when I'm listening to people or attending field visits, I'm asking a lot of questions, learning about their research or through reading papers. I'm trying to find, what is this thing? What can I connect it to? What are the connecting threads to some kind of personal experience so that then I can go through that? And so, it's different for every kind of project, but I'm looking for that human essence. What can I share that we all share, right? My greatest pain is equal to your greatest pain, even if the circumstances and details are different. If it's the greatest pain I know, it's the greatest pain you know. We all know love and joy and loss and sadness, right? And fear and hope. So I'm looking for those essences that then I can pull from, to then use and figure out what else to do with it, or then what might that look like in the material world? How can I manifest that?
Hello. So I have a question about what the primary purpose of art should be. It's a more philosophical question. So as a ballet dancer myself, I don't really have any politics in my art, or at least it's not super involved. And I was just sort of wondering, do you think that art should, in this day and age, should it have the primary purpose of advancing a political goal? Like, is that an important element of art? Or do you think it's valid to keep politics out of art and just make it more about a deep experience with an audience?
That's a great question, and you would get 1,000 different answers if you asked 1,000 different artists. However, I will say, Ellen Dissanayake, who wrote Where Art Comes From and Why, she talks a lot about how art was this notion of making something special. We can look way back to peoples of many different kind of tribes. They would have certain moments where they would make something special, change the inflection of their voice, drink out of a special pot, wear a special clothing, move their body in a very special way. And so I believe, and in essence, art is communicating, as I said, all these other experiences beyond our five senses and making things special. Now, whether that becomes political or not, I think that's the intention of the artist. I did not start out intending to make political work, but my work has become political because our leaders have made climate change and environmental issues political. If that is I don't think that's any one purpose. I think we need all of it. We need these deep emotional, personal experiences. We need the political activism. We need the critical institutional and societal and cultural critiques. We need it all. That's the beauty of art. It can be everything.
You called yourself an installation artist, that you work a lot with big art. I was just wondering if you've ever felt limited by the spaces you present in, the galleries, or I guess a better way to phrase this is there a space that you would like to be able to present your art in that you have yet not been able to?
That's a great question. I think there's many spaces I would like to show my art in, and hopefully those opportunities will arise. I often will the space becomes part of the work. Sometimes I'm making things like the spiral can go in multiple places, right? But sometimes I have an opportunity where I'm working with the architecture of that space, or in the case of the new piece I'm doing, we're specifically going to be putting signs on buses, so I have to look at the bus. I have to look at the colors of the bus. I have to think about who's going to see it. Is it on the street side? Is it on the sidewalk side? Are they seeing it from behind? Are they seeing it from a vehicle? So space becomes an integral part, whether it is confined within an architecture or whether it is something that I'm wanting to do. There's certainly some pieces that I've done that worked really well in some spaces and maybe not as well in other spaces because of the architectural parameters. I have done a few things outside. I would like to do more things outside. I mean, I think that'll just be dependent really on the content of the piece rather than having a very specific space in mind. But, a completely round, circular, almost like a planetarium. I have done a couple of planetarium shows. Would be great because the sound and the acoustics and things. So I think there's more that I can't even see or imagine, which is what's exciting for me. I'll have to think about it.
Considering the topic of sustainability and climate change, I was wondering, I noticed in the art pieces there's a lot of like application of smaller pieces or the resin. I was wondering if you could tell us more about how you source your materials and if there's a process of recycling when you're doing your art pieces.
That's a really good question, a really important one that I'm still resolving. Some of the pieces, that clear garden, for example, generated a lot of garbage. One could argue, does the end justify the means? I don't know, not always. There certainly are pieces that I had made a specific sculpture using its garbage as part of its structure. I have endless amounts of piles of things that I save and reuse. Anytime that I use styrofoam, I am personally driving it back to the plant. They're the only place that will recycle it, truly recycle it. So I will take all the efforts that I can to do that, but it does. We can also look at science, though, and all the beakers and the gloves. There still is generation of garbage, and I don't know how to resolve all of that. But when I can, I try and have the practice is sustainable. And I think that's one of the reasons with video, is that it has a component with that. Although you could argue, anytime you're doing anything online, there is servers out there, right, that are using tremendous amounts of water to cool them. So it's not a simple answer. And I think it's important for me to keep thinking about it and keep questioning it and keep trying to answer that. You guys have great questions. They're critical thinkers, dare I say, going back to the intro.
Hi. As an installation artist who is focused on using immersion to deliver your message, do you think it's the responsibility of people in scientific fields to like convey their data in a more immersive manner? Or like, how do you, if you're in the field of science, how do you convey the data and make it more digestible, but also not lose any of the nuance involved?
Well, this is where I feel interdisciplinary collaboration works at its best, so that the scientists don't have to dumb down or change the data. That is critical data that we need to be able to understand the world, understand the changes of the world. And so through the collaboration, the artist can then be subjective, right? And it doesn't have to take away. It goes back to that seesaw, right, of letting people kind of come together. I think scientists are brilliant at creating graphs. I mean, I've never seen so many graphs and posters, but it's still hard to understand them. But if it's so easily digestible, then it brings that question, how relevant is it? So I think we need to have both. We don't necessarily need to change. I think it's us coming together and working together and bringing our expertise that are actually going to help kind of work with that. I mean, you know, disseminating in the broader community kind of impact is really important, I know, for NSF grants. That is an important component. And often they're looking, you know, scientists are looking to collaborate with artists specifically on some of those components. Especially in the time of, you know, fake news. We need that data. We need that provable data. We need it to be sound.
So your art is focused on, and you touched upon this, making an experience that conveys empathy to the audience. How do you go about approaching creating empathy with the data?
You know, that's a good question. I think some of it is when I share my vulnerability. Right? If I share something that's vulnerable, the first sound piece I played for you was very vulnerable for me. Even I'm listening, I'm like, oh, I'm playing this again. You know, I think that the more vulnerable I am, the more it might relate to someone else and allow them to get in touch with their own vulnerability. So I don't know that I'm necessarily creating empathy, but hopefully it's also not just around sorrow. That there's things, we are inspired by awe and beauty. Right? If you think of the sublime, and especially living in the West, that people came out here and were just in awe of how beautiful and gorgeous this planet is and this landscape. At the same time, part of that awe, I believe, is that we feel small. We are not the biggest thing out here, right? And there's a little bit of danger because we're not. And so that, I think a lot about human nature and this notion of being so open and inspired by awe and beauty, but also including that being small. We like feeling small. And that's what gives me hope that we might actually be able to care about things beyond ourselves and allow ourselves to be small rather than the top of that chain, you know, coming down.
So for a couple of your pieces, you, like you mentioned before, and like how we heard, you incorporate like the spoken part with it as well. How do you go about like creating that? Do you firstly like create the art and then like sort of use it as like the audio part as a reflection, or does that kind of like, or do you start with the written part and then make the art, or how does that process work? And which one do you think is like more impactful?
You know, it's a combination. Sometimes I've started with a script, the ideas, and sometimes, and then the work has followed that. Sometimes the work is halfway made, and I'm also simultaneously working on a script if I know that's going to be part of it, and sometimes it comes after. You know, it's usually, you know, I'm always taking lots of notes and brainstorming about my ideas and my thoughts and what the piece is, and sometimes I'm just intuitively driven to make something, and then I force myself to stop. I'm like, okay, why? What is this? What is the personal connection? Or what am I actually trying to say? Or what can I link? So it happens in a multitude of ways. And I don't know that one is more powerful than the other. I like that writing has become more of a component in my work. The idea of performing it, I still am torn. There's some actresses I'm like, oh, I could have her read everything that I do because I like a certain voice. Or I've been thinking about a piece of hiring a child actress. So those kinds of things I think could broaden the scope. But then I've also recently worked on a piece that was very much about the diary. And when you read some of the famous diaries of historical events, they're describing the physical world as we're seeing it or whatever that experience is, but they're always reflecting on this internal interpretation or this internal perspective. And so I've been doing that a lot more, and then I feel like my voice becomes important, that I also perform it. So although I've been doing it for a few years, I still feel like I'm very new in the writing of it and the reciting of it. That's a great question.
So I'm going to say maybe a couple more questions. Were you pointing me down there, or you? Okay.
So a lot of your art uses digital media to convey messages, and my question is, as technology progresses, do you think art will take new forms, and do you think technological progression is good or bad?
So that's a loaded question, that second part, but the first part is easier. I think it already is progressing. We're looking at NFTs, we see things online, right, that only exist online. I think it's already, AI is such a huge component now, even of creating artwork. I think it is. In some ways, I'm just still, you know, with a camera looking out in nature, filming. So I haven't gone there, and I don't necessarily feel pulled to do that at this time. As far as technology being good or bad, everything has a sunshine side and a shadow side. And I think we can bring it down to ethics, right? It's how you use it. Technology has been amazing. Just think of some of the medical marvels that we've been able to do with technology. But it also has the potential to do some really terrible things. So I think that's, again, evaluating what the human intention is, right? And what's motivating us to do things. But I think it definitely has the potential to have a very strong sunshine side as well.
So artists tend to have a message or idea they want to get across to the audience, but do you feel that art can have bias, or is the interpretation of art truly up to the viewer?
I think the artist's intention can certainly be biased, and very often is, I would argue. But the interpretation of the viewer, we can only guess at it. We can try and figure out, I'm always asking my students, what do you want the viewer to walk away with, or what do you want them to experience? We can guess at it. But people are going to come with their own experiences through their own lens, that lens of their culture, the lens of their formative years, whether it's a belief system. So we can't necessarily control that. I think it's going to happen regardless. And I think that there are some artists who are very interested. They know they're making work for a specific audience. And they're maybe not going to have it broader. And some artists who make much broader work to attract a broader audience. I mean, I think the artist can choose between that, but we're never really going to be able to say, oh, you're going to have the exact same experience as someone else with it. No, it's always going to be different in some way, which is part of what makes it exciting. That's why we have guilty pleasure songs that we all like, right?
I'm gonna do one last question, and then we're gonna let Dr. Wischer take a break and give her a big round of applause for.
I like that you guys have so many
presentation.
questions, and you're clearly thinking, so I really appreciate that.
Do you ever find that like an artist's bias is like contradicts scientific research or data?
I think it certainly can. I think more often the artist doesn't have the right information, is maybe naive about that scientific or data, and therefore makes certain claims about that. But usually it's coming from a naive point rather than them trying to contradict it. But I'm sure there's people out there who are also contradicting things. I mean, you know, again, art can be about everything and anything, and so I'm sure there's room for that in there somewhere. I personally try and at least be true to what's there at the moment. Ironically, when they discovered that the CO2 was being exhaled, so to speak, from the salt crust, the science changed from the time that we created the exhibit through the run of the exhibit. So all of a sudden, even the scientific data that was on the wall was different. But it was what it was, right? That's how science is. We only know what we know until we learn something different. So I think that's also shifting and changing within artworks too.
Wendy, I want to thank you so much for this talk. It was inspiring, and mid-talk applause is kind of a cool thing.
It was,
and the
very
questions
much
are telling you what a great thing this was, and Honors is really grateful for your contributions and for your willingness to be here tonight.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm certainly honored. Thanks.